On the morning of March 10th, 2012, in Mykolaiv, Ukraine, a motorist heard a soft moaning sound coming from an abandoned building. Under a charred sheet, he saw something slowly moving. When he lifted the sheet, the man discovered the naked and severely burned woman lying inside the basement of an old hospital. Her shocking, brutal story that would be revealed led to revolts against the corrupt institutions that helped perpetuate and ignore gender-based violence. Who was this poor victim, and what kind of monster left her to die, burning alive? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. Ukraine is not immune to bizarre, horrific cases of murder, but in 2012, the country was appalled by several brutal crimes. A judge, his wife, their son, and daughter-in-law were discovered all dead inside an apartment. Their heads were all missing. Their vicious assailants were never found. A 4-year-old child was found dead in Sevastopol. The little girl had suffered a massive blow to her head. It would later be learned that she was beaten to death by 5 children, aged 7 to 11. They killed her out of jealousy because their mother was taking care of her. A 25-year-old woman was found in Kamyanka with several cuts on her head and legs. She had been beaten and was sexually assaulted, and dogs had been set on her to attack. This woman lay in the street dying, begging for people to help her all night. But the residents were too scared to call the police. Yet these senseless, horrifyingly violent, and notably bizarre crimes paled in comparison to the events that unfolded in March of that same year. This is the story of Oksana Makar. When this young woman was found abandoned at the old hospital, smoldering in flames, the stranger who found her contacted emergency services, and she was immediately transported to the nearest hospital. 55% of her body had been burned. Barely alive, the young woman would face unimaginable pain and suffering from what she had endured the night before. The girl's kidneys had been burned. Multiple surgeries later, the girl had lost both of her legs and her right arm. But amazingly, she would live long enough to tell her story. She regained consciousness briefly after surgery, but then doctors placed her into an induced coma. The severity of her burns and the damage done to her lungs required that she be transferred to a specialist unit in Donetsk for treatment. Initially, doctors believed her condition was improving and her prognosis was hopeful. The victim was later identified as 18-year-old Oksana Makar. She told the police about what had been done to her. The night before, she had met 2 men at a bar in town called the Little Fish. They had all been partying, heavily drinking, and toward the end of the night, they convinced her to leave and go with them to one of their friends' houses nearby. At some point, one of them made a sexual gesture to her, and when she showed a lack of interest, these 3 fun, outgoing young men turned into monsters. They held Oksana down and raped her, taking turns with this helpless, intoxicated woman. After they were done with her, she threatened to go to the police. One of the men grabbed a cord and began to strangle her. Oksana did everything she could, struggling to fight them off, but the man easily overpowered the young petite woman, believing she was already dead or close to it. They wrapped up her body and carried it to an abandoned building, lighting her aflame. She was burning alive. They had ignited her body into flames while she was still breathing. At some point, she regained consciousness. Oksana Makar, during her incomprehensible suffering, had identified her 3 rapists and her attempted murderers, leading to their prompt arrest. However, only one remained in custody. The prosecutor's office claimed that they did not have enough evidence to keep the other 2 men in jail. At this point, they were considered witnesses to the crime. Ukraine's chief police officer, Vitaly Zachenko, quickly confirmed they were in fact the sons of former government officials. The suspect the police held finally broke his silence and confessed to what had happened that night. During his interrogation, the man told the police in gruesome detail how Oksana Makar was assaulted in a flat in the city. The men had then wrapped her in a blanket and abandoned her inside a pit within the abandoned hospital. He claimed that he only started the fire in an attempt to get rid of a pillowcase that had been accidentally wrapped up inside the blanket with her. The 3 men then went to the supermarket to purchase more vodka and stopped for a tea at a kiosk. The interrogation video of suspect Yevgeny Krasnashuk was published online by the Kiev Post. On YouTube, it was viewed 100,000 times on the first day. Everyone could witness the young man speaking in graphic detail about how he raped and strangled this vulnerable young woman he had just met that night by chance. He said that he choked her first with his hands and then tightly wrapped a cord around her neck. The man was void of any emotion. He expressed no remorse, no regret, or concern over the heinous crime he had committed. When the video of her news of the 2 men's release and complete lack of criminal charges hit the media, the community was outraged and they took to the streets. Protests erupted in Mykolaiv and other regions of Ukraine, including Lviv, Odessa, and Kharkiv, calling for the investigators to all be replaced. It refueled the public debate on the pervasive political corruption that existed in Ukraine and the lack of justice it had for its residents. Hundreds of people marched in the streets and in front of the judicial building to demand justice for Oksana Makar. The residents of Ukraine were tired of their voices being silenced. They would refuse to remain quiet over this brutal sexual violent act and horrendous death this young woman experienced, especially in light of how many of them have been victims of abuse and violence, especially at the hands of the elite, what are referred to as mezdohoros in Ukraine. The wealthiest, most powerful, and influential businessmen and government officials and their sons have long been the subject of endless anger, criticism, and controversy by politicians, civil activists, and journalists. These men are known for using their status to do whatever they please because they know they will get away with it. A Donetsk businessman, Vladimir Kliviko, during a drunk conversation with law enforcement officers, told them, and I quote, "When I want to, I snort cocaine. When I want to, I shoot up. When I want to, I drink. When I want to, I drive. When I want to, I have sex. When I want to, I use my gun." One municipal council officer in Uzhgorod even began a shootout in a crowded cafe, shouting to everyone that the cops couldn't do anything to him because he is good friends with the Uzhgorod's police chief's son. Countless crimes and violent behavior have been covered up because at the time of these events, there was no accountability for those in power. When Oksana Makar was raped and murdered, the people would no longer accept inaction and injustice. Shouts amongst the angry residents shattered long-existing silence. "Your daughter could be next. They kill us on the roads, and now they set us on fire. These 3 beasts don't have the right to walk the earth." A burned effigy was filmed in front of the district prosecutor's office. The moment was plastered across every television station and newspaper. The murder and burning of Oksana Makar had set off a media circus unlike anything Ukraine had ever experienced. The leader of the country at this time, President Viktor Yanukovych, was shaken and upset by the people's outrage. He did his best to calm their anger by reassuring them that these rapists and maniacs who committed this crime would face justice. He immediately ordered a new investigation team to head to Mykolaiv. This led to the two previously released sons of former government officials to be rearrested. On March 13th, all three suspects were charged with attempted murder and rape. These charges would later be changed, though, to Yevgeny Krasnuchek being the only offender charged with murder. Both President Viktor Yanukovych and Prime Minister Nikolai Azarov called for just punishment of the accused. They told the people, no compromises, only with the knowledge that punishment is inevitable with these monsters. Fear to encroach on people's lives and rights. Oksana Makar struggled to breathe. Every moment of her existence had become complete agony. Upon the insistence of her mother, Tatiana Suravitskia, she filmed from her hospital bed on YouTube her last moments. In this distressing video, she expresses her rage toward her assailants, telling the camera exactly how they deserve the harshest of punishments. The young woman is visibly uncomfortable and upset and tries to keep herself and her wounds covered, but her mother tells her not to. When Oksana starts to discuss what had happened to her, she suddenly stops, breaking off and saying that she just can't do it. But her mother insists to say a couple of words to Ukraine. Oksana Makar calls for her rapists to be shot, castrated, their balls fed to dogs, or just send them to prison for life and see what happens to them there. When asked how she goes on, the young woman stared at the camera and simply said, "How I will live, I will live. That's all." This video received outrage from many viewers, seeing it as a second violation of Oksana Makar, this time by her mother. They didn't understand how or why a mother could force her daughter to put herself on video in the most severe physical and traumatic state. Most viewers felt nothing but sympathy and compassion for young Oksana Makar, and hundreds donated money to help her mother with her medical care. Her mother was later accused of spending these funds on herself instead, and that she had reportedly been receiving money for interviews. In response, all her mother had to say was to the press, "Look at me. Do I look like a rich woman?" Tragically, the young woman's injuries were far too severe, and even though the doctors did everything imaginable to keep her alive, her body could not endure the damage. At only 18 years old, Oksana Makar's heart stopped beating due to the bleeding in her lungs. Doctors attempted to resuscitate her 3 times without success. On March 29th, almost 20 days after she was viciously assaulted and left to die in a fire, Oksana Makar drew her last breath. Her mother morbidly selected a wedding gown to bury her daughter in. The reason she gave for this was that thanks to the men who had killed her daughter Oksana, she would never be able to become a bride. In October 2012, the fate of all 3 of Oksana Makar's offenders would unfold. According to the prosecution, the 3 perpetrators had thrown a lit pillowcase on top of Oksana Makar's nude, unconscious body. And yet, a piece of cloth was not capable of remaining on fire, much less in freezing temperatures, for several hours. Yet, for some unknown reason, an expert was never commissioned to testify as to how the victim had received such horrendous burns. There was much speculation, but no evidence as to how Oksana Makar was lying in a fire when she was found. Although he initially confessed strangling Oksana Makar during his interrogation video, Yevgeny Krasnuchek now claimed that he was not the one to choke her, or at least not in the way everyone thought. According to Oksana's mother's lawyer, Yevgeny swore that he strangled her to save her life to ensure that the other 2 men didn't actually kill her. Yevgeny Krasnochek stated that he purposely did not use harsh force on Oksana's neck while choking her so that she would just pass out, but that the other two guys would think she was already dead. Once she passed out, he said he told them that he had killed her. But then once again he changed his story and on the stand testified that it was another one of the offenders that strangled Oksana. Krasnochek claimed that he took the blame out of fear for himself and his family. When the judge inquired as to why he would now change his testimony, Krasnochek claimed that a man came to his cell in jail and offered him money in exchange if he would take full responsibility for the murder and not the others. He said it was then that he knew something was not right and that he must tell the truth. The other two suspects both denied their involvement in Oksana Makar's rape or murder. They strongly stood by their testimony that they were too frightened of Yevgeny Krasnochek to intervene. Yevgeny Krasnochek, 23, who was the only one of the three defendants to admit his participation in the rape, his confession to her murder, and involvement in setting her on fire, faced the harshest punishment. He was given life imprisonment for his role in the crimes. The other two men, Maxim Prasnik, 24, and Artem Pograsian, 22, the sons of the former government officials, would receive 15 years and 14 years respectively. Although there was some semblance of justice, Mykola Kotelnich, a politician and leader of the European Party of Ukraine, was not satisfied. He declared to the press on behalf of Oksana Makar's mother that they would not rest until all three defendants were given the most severe penalty possible under the law. Oksana Makar's mother was initially received by the country and the media with endless compassion and support, both emotionally and financially. Millions of hryvnia, which is the official currency of Ukraine, was given to the mother. However, once she filmed her suffering daughter dying, and there was evidence that she had been pocketing the charity, their perceptions of Tatiana quickly changed. Then the dark truth about Oksana Makar's life and her mother's began to surface. The following is based on the personal account of Oksana Makar's mentor at her boarding school. 2003, when Oksana Makar was only 9 years old, she attended a boarding school in Shavrokola Nivka, 50 kilometers away from Mykolaiv. Her mother was released from prison in 2004, and that summer she picked up her daughter and took her on vacation with her. That autumn, a 50-year-old man came to the boarding school wanting to take young Oksana away for the weekend. He claimed to be her mother's good friend and left a present for Oksana Makar when he left. Inside a box was sexy lingerie. The girl immediately got flushed and said, "That's for my mom," but her mentor observed that the size was an extra small. He immediately went to the principal of the boarding school with his concerns, and Oksana Makar ended up running away from the school at the start of 2005. A month passed until he received a call from the police in Hulukovo, about 600 kilometers away. When he went to the precinct to pick up Oksana, she cried, telling him she had ran away because of what her uncle Vova was doing to her. That summer, while selling apples at the promenade in Mykolaiv, he had lured her inside his home, sexually abusing her. When Oksana's mother found out about what had happened, instead of punishing this man, she used the situation to her advantage. She blackmailed her brother and forced her 11-year-old daughter Oksana to move into her uncle's house, and in return, she received regular payments. She was only 5 years old when her uncle began to rape her. The mentor informed the principal, who contacted Oksana's mother and the police. Oksana's mother completely lost it, calling them whores and thieves, protesting that everything they said was lies. She would end up bringing in a medical certificate which swore that Oksana was still a virgin. Not long after this incident, Oksana ran away again. Nothing was ever pursued against the allegations made against her mother and Uncle Vova. The country was divided on who was to blame for the death of Oksana Makar. Across the internet and social media, the victim became the subject of passionate debate. Some blamed the victim for the horrible circumstances that led to her rape and death. And some were straight up on the side of the rapist. Some people viewed Oksana Makar as a whore, trash, who had led these young men on and who asked for what she was given. Some angry, hateful bloggers even went so far to condemn Oksana Makar, posting vulgar statements like, and I quote, "I'm on their side. They are heroes. 19 years old and trailing around bars. The slut. Fact. Serve the bitch right." Others actively rallied around the rapists and murderers, even collecting money to help with their legal aid and raise funds for their bail. This mission was led by a woman. And national TV channel 24 TV polled their viewers, asking, was Makar herself in any way responsible for this tragic event? To which 77% polled answered yes. Others would claim that the two men believed to be Musoros were in fact regular citizens. But the concept of punishing these kids of the most influential took over the truth, and they were unfairly persecuted. Olena Kabashna from the Ukrainian Helsinki Group, a human rights organization, believed it was the lawlessness of the culture, the darkness, and the sickness of society that was really to blame for the crime. It was noted how the primary perpetrator, the defendant who had murdered Oksana Makar, had suffered a horrible childhood of violent abuse, the passiveness of the other two defendants, who did nothing to stop this violence. Oksana's own mother may have been the most twisted of them all. She prostituted her child when she was alive and in her death. The political agendas and media hunger that exploited every aspect of the case, but in particular, Oksana Makar's death, to read that some residents not only blamed Oksana Makar for what happened to her, but that some even defended the rapists and killers, is shocking, disgusting, and difficult to hear, which it is. But the truth is that sexual violence committed against girls and women has frequently brought up the concept of the whore versus Madonna, which victims of rape and sexual assault still are forced to cope with. Society, but in particular patriarchal and misogynistic-based societies, still perceive women in these unfair, archaic, and unjustified divisions. It was not that long ago that criminal courts in the United States were allowed to include testimony and evidence relating to the sexual history and activity of a rape victim, including cases of murder. What became known in the criminal law as rape shield statutes, their first of its kind was established in 1979 in Michigan. These statutes limit the admissibility of evidence about past sexual behavior, other than the act that is at issue in the charge. Prior to these laws, any evidence or general reputation around a lack of chastity could be used in court to attack the credibility of the victim at trial. Such testimony no doubtedly led to many jurors questioning the legitimacy of the assault charges, and in general allowed defense attorneys to paint the victim in the least sympathetic light. There are countless cases of rape, sexual assault, trafficking, and even homicide where this once was allowed in criminal court. One particularly infamous case comes to mind is the 1986 Preppy Killer murder, where 18-year-old woman Jennifer Levin was raped and brutally murdered by handsome, media-ready Robert Chambers. This young woman's name was dragged through the mud by the defense counsel and the media. It wouldn't be until the mid-1990s when the majority of other states would enact legislation based on Michigan's 1979 statute. When the federal government established the Violence Against Women Act of 1994, this helped to solidify rape shield statutes around the country. These statutes are relevant to Oksana Makar's story because not only does Ukraine lack such protection for victims of sexual violence, but shockingly, there are no official crime statistics recorded for rape or domestic violence victims at all. Any recorded data has been collected from the United Nations and other countries that have researched the issue. A United Nations report in 2013 revealed that 45% of the 45 million Ukrainians experienced violence through sexual, physical, and/or mental abuse, the majority of its sufferers being women. Again, there are no official records or statistics by the Ukrainian government on sexual violence. It was merely a well-known but not discussed fact within their culture. Studies conducted by the United Nations and other Western countries indicate that violence committed against women and girls is not restricted to a certain area of the country, and it occurs across all social classes. Sexual exploitation of women and girls is also rampant, with as high as a third of young unemployed Ukrainian women having been involved in some degree of illegal sexual activity. It is believed that gender-based violence kills approximately 600 Ukrainian women a year, which, considering there are no official statistics on this crime, the numbers are likely to be grossly underreported. Violence against women has only escalated since Russia invaded its country in 2014, with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights reporting that women's deaths caused by violence were 3 times higher than those associated with the war. Ukraine, similar to much of Eastern Europe, faces a crisis of sexual violence, including rape, exploitation, and trafficking of its girls and young women. The charity Alliance for Public Health reported there was an estimate of 86,000 sex workers in 2019. And since Russia launched a full-fledged invasion of their country, the issue has only escalated in Ukraine. Many girls and women in Ukraine are expected to remain in traditional gender roles, and there are very few legitimate opportunities which empower them to financially support themselves, much less feed and clothe their children. Unless they are married, most of them have menial jobs that barely support basic living conditions. The most common profile of a sex worker is a single young mother who is uneducated and lacks any valuable skills in the workforce, left with few options they have to make money to be able to rent a house and support their children. These young women are faced with performing sex work. Law enforcement widely ignores them, and society views them as the fallen women. They are not protected legally, nor are they provided with social support or health care. During the same year of the horrific rape and murder of Oksana Makar, the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, Thomas Hammerberg, published a report based upon his findings there during a visit in late November 2011. He concluded that the severe deficiencies within the functions of the justice system led to a gross hindrance of the citizens' human rights. It was found that the judiciary was highly vulnerable to corruption by outside influences. There was also great concern regarding the lack of rights for the defense versus the prosecution. Citing a large imbalance of power, the commissioner also addressed how there must be oversight of law enforcement's behavior towards citizens, and how they need to be held accountable for their criminal actions, which have included rape, extortion, and severe beatings. Ukraine is a sovereign, independent, democratic, social, legal state. In 2012, the Criminal Procedural Code of Ukraine was established. It closely mirrors international standards, but whether or not the conditions set forth by the code have been implemented is an entirely different matter. The criminal justice system of Ukraine is structured similarly to the U.S. and many Western nations, with courts of general jurisdiction, which include local courts, appellate courts, or specialized courts, which are similar to the superior courts of the United States. And then at the top is their equivalent of SCOTUS. The Constitutional Court of Ukraine is the sole body of constitutional jurisdiction in Ukraine, whose purpose is to guarantee the supremacy of the Constitution. This court resolves issues of conformity of laws and other legal acts with the Constitution of Ukraine and provides the official interpretation of its Constitution and the laws. In other words, their word is the law. The problem is that this body of justice is perhaps the most corrupt level of government. The trust towards the courts by the residents of Ukraine is alarmingly low. By late 2014, only 10% believed in them, and only 1% fully believed in the justice system. Defined by oligarchy, the system was operated, defined, and controlled by a very small group of individuals in positions of power and influence. Ever since Ukraine gained its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, it has continued to face new versions of the same type of government. They ignore the whole of society and work in the best interest of those in power. Oksana Makar's brutal death was a catalyst for change, or at least hopeful change, which has been actively sought since by the people of Ukraine. What was known as the Revolution of Dignity in 2013 to 2014, there was a big demand for judicial reform, yet the changes have been minimal. The system remains undeveloped, doesn't focus on the rights of its citizens, and the judges continue to lack integrity, efficiency, transparency, and balance. It was observed that their current system of legal counsel is terribly constructed. It doesn't function to provide any semblance of respect, professionalism, or power to their position. Lawyers are essentially looked down upon. The largest issue within the justice system is that very few judgments are actually carried through. According to the Ministry of Justice, roughly 80% of sentences given are never executed. Prosecutors also fail to align with European standards. Criminal investigators lack autonomy, and the system as a whole suffers from poor IT infrastructure. The justice system also suffers from not having an individualized approach based on evidence to prevent crime, rehabilitate or resocialize individuals who do violate the law, and very few offenders who are not incarcerated. The justice system also suffers from not having an individualized approach based on evidence to prevent crime, rehabilitate or socialize individuals who violate the law, and very few offenders are given penalties outside of incarceration. In these respects, Ukraine doesn't seem to differ much from the current crime control model implemented by the United States, most likely spurred by the outrage expressed by the residents of Ukraine after Oksana Makar's murder. There were substantial steps made toward judicial reform between 2012 and 2014. However, the powers given by these reforms exceeded the functions of the constitutional law. Due to this conflict, there have been major setbacks and obstacles to the Code of Criminal Procedure being successfully implemented. A strategy for reforming the justice system was established to update legislation, which would help restore society's diminished confidence in the judiciary. In 2016, Parliament adopted several amendments regarding the criminal justice system, including the judiciary. One of the most significant amendments was to the Constitutional Court, who now had the sole power to dismiss its judges. The other significant amendment was the establishment of anti-corruption protections, and how the prosecution no longer held oversight over law enforcement. The courts were also restructured under these amendments, and the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court and the High Court of Intellectual Property was established. Interestingly, the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court is made up not just of tenured members of the judiciary, but also lawyers and legal academics who have 10 or more years of experience. The primary goal of these reforms, however, has yet to be reached, which is reflected in the terrible approval ratings by the residents of Ukraine. They have yet to gain the rights to a fair trial by an independent, professional, and impartial court. On October 27, 2020, the Constitutional Court ruled that the National Agency for Preventing Corruption, also known as NAPC, was in fact unconstitutional. The Constitutional Court effectively tore the agency apart, in particular dismantling its asset declaration system and the subsequent penalties associated with this violation. This system was critical to help minimize corruption amongst both appointed and elected government officials. The asset declaration system was one of the requirements set by the International Monetary Fund in order to continue providing loans to Ukraine. As to why the Constitutional Court eliminated this pertinent system, it is believed that they are the most adversely impacted by it. Members of the Constitutional Court are the highest power in government. Any decision they make cannot be reversed or appealed. There is no agency which oversees their decisions, much less enforces their impartiality. These judges are some of the wealthiest, most influential individuals in the country, making on average 20 times the national average. But many past declarations have not been reflective of this salary, and there is evidence of their covering up their assets. President Zelensky drafted a law to get rid of the court's current judges and annul this ruling. But this law would violate the Constitution. Ever since Russia launched its full invasion of Ukraine, Zelensky has made continued efforts at real judicial reform, but yet he and the Constitutional Court stand at a stalemate. Women in Ukraine have equal constitutional rights as men, but they are not represented or treated equally to men in society, especially within the realm of politics. Positions of power and influence are highly restricted to women, with parliament currently comprised of 22%. Very few women are economically independent, much less own their own homes or businesses. I am sure, as in most countries, there are exceptions to the rule, depending on the region and the personal circumstances of the woman's life. This is not a reflection of all males in Ukrainian society, but women must be represented in more political and legal affairs in order for their voices to be listened to and for their bodies and lives to be protected. On a personal note, I've had a few interactions with residents of Ukraine, and they have been nothing but lovely. They are kind, respectful, warm, and hardworking people. My original score for this podcast was co-created by myself and a young Ukrainian male artist, and it was a wonderful, fulfilling experience. I wanted to share Oksana Makar's story because violence against girls and women is an international crisis that only seems to be escalating every year. It is not just one country's problem, nor is it only one group's issue to solve. It affects every race, ethnicity, religion, and social class. Only as a united global community can we ever hope to eradicate this virus of violence that continues to invade the lives of females around the world. Thank you so much for listening to the tragic story of Ukraine's Oksana Makar. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts about this episode or ideas for future ones, please reach out. I would love to hear from you. You can find my contact information in the episode description below. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music, Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.